We at CISA and NDU are very pleased to provide to you today Jim Sciutto. Many of you have seen him on TV. He is CNN's chief national security correspondent and anchor of CNN's Newsroom, airing Monday through Friday, 9 to 11 in the morning. But Jim has reported from more than 50 countries, including Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iran. He was an ABC News correspondent for many years and is author of the new book, one I'm a big fan of, called The Shadow War. We were just discussing, because my book, New Rules of War, spends a lot of time also on shadow war, so obviously, huge fanboy, I suppose. He has won Emmy Awards, Edward Morrow Award, and a Polk Award, and the White House Correspondent Association's Merriman Smith Award for Excellence in Presidential Coverage. Before he became a journalist, he was a Chinese scholar from Yale, and he was chief of staff and senior advisor to the U.S. ambassador to China, Gary Locke. Please welcome, a very warm welcome to Mr. Sciutto. Thank you.
And thanks so much to all of you. Thank you, Ambassador Holtz, for inviting me, General, to all of you joining today. Particular thanks to my 7-year-old daughter who's joining, who I stole out of the second grade today to join. And I'm expecting very hard questions later. And I appreciate the warm introduction. Thanks so much. Look forward to your questions and yours. I wanted to begin today with a vision of how, in my reporting, brief work in the State Department over the last decades, sadly, the new world disorder that I'm seeing developing and that I'm trying to get across to my viewers, and that I know, given the experience and the service in this room and folks watching online, that you have a lot of experience of, I'm sure, as well. Before I get there, though, I wanted to talk to you about how I came to this vision to some degree. As a journalist, I'll often say to folks that my job is to be a witness to history. And it began before I was even out of college, and it's the reason I have these newspapers, picture of a newspaper, several newspapers up on the screen today. I was a freshman in college, coming to the end of my freshman year. It was 1989. May, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to study, what I wanted my major to be. And I was thinking about American political history, anything that a poet thinks about studying in college. It wasn't going to be engineering, it wasn't going to be medicine, maybe English literature. But as it happened, I have a sister who was studying in Taiwan at the time. And my parents and another of my sisters had gone to visit her, and they went on a trip through China. And they went to Xi'an to see the Terracotta Warriors, and of course they went to Beijing, Forbidden City. And they found themselves in May 1989 in the midst of a popular revolution. We have family photos from Tiananmen Square in May 1989 during happier times in those protests there. They left the day that martial law was declared, the end of May 1989, and as they continued their trip around Asia, they, of course, woke up on the morning of June 4th to the sad events, and that those young students they had seen there celebrating, it ended poorly and sadly for a movement that had so much hope. And my mom collected some of the newspapers and kept them, and when she died a number of years ago, I was going through her things and found them. So I've kept them for myself. When I was in college at the time, as this was happening, I said, you know what, I think I have an idea of what I want to study, and that's China. This is going to be a part of my life and all of our lives going forward. And it was a great way to begin. I was at Yale. We had a professor there named Jonathan Spence, who had just written a book called The Search for Modern China, prescient about many of the historical trends that have followed since. But it also, beyond inspiring me to study China as a student, after college, I said, what I really want to do is I want to go over there and live. And like any college graduate, I mean, you guys had plans, I'm sure, long before me, but a college graduate who doesn't know quite what he or she wants to do, you apply for a fellowship. So I applied for a Fulbright fellowship to go to Hong Kong. My Chinese language skills were not great, so I figured, let me start in a place where I could at least get by with English and then study it. Did that for a year, and did not want to leave Asia, so I ended up staying there for a number of years working as a reporter. And that launched me on this career that I've been in really for 30 years since, except for a brief stop in the State Department. And one consistent fact of that life is that you find yourself with the privilege of being a witness to history many times. My family was an accidental witness to history in 1989, and since that, through those years of assignments around Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and here in the US, I've found myself an accidental witness to history more times than I can count. And I think of 1997, the handover of Hong Kong back to Britain. I think of being on the roof of my apartment building in Washington, D.C. on the morning of September 11th, watching the Pentagon burning and going there. I think of being one of the first journalists into Afghanistan when U.S. forces invaded there following 9/11. And then a couple of years later, found myself with U.S. Special Forces at the tip of the spear of another invasion, this time of Iraq. We landed in northern Iraq early then. But those weren't the only moments. Last year, I found myself at the start of another war. I was in Kyiv in February 2022. And prior to that, for a number of weeks, I've been talking to military officials, sources of mine, who told me, really going back to November in 2021, that Russia's going to invade Ukraine. And you need to be ready, and we need to be ready. And I remember the first time I spoke to my colleagues about that and began to report some of the stories, the intelligence about Russia's buildup of the force there, and you'll remember this, there was a lot of skepticism. Right up to the day Russian forces crossed the border, this word imminent had become almost a joke here in Washington. Imminent invasion of Ukraine. Is it really going to happen? The Ukrainians are exaggerating it, you in Washington are exaggerating it. But, of course, it did happen, and here we are about to come up on the one-year anniversary of the biggest war, bloodiest war certainly in Europe since World War II. As I was in Kyiv and later in the western part of Ukraine, I found myself many times over finding myself almost time transported back to a different era. And just wanted to play some of those images that brought that to the fore for me. This is an air raid siren over Lviv on the first day of the war. This is just a handful of the many millions of Ukrainians who fled their country in those early days or weeks of war. Biggest refugee movement, again, since World War II. And these were just some preparations downtown as these historic buildings were turned into bunkers by Ukrainian soldiers. Now those, of course, were color pictures. They were color images shot on my iPhone, but I turned them to black and white because as I was walking the streets at the time, I kept thinking to myself, I feel like I'm in a time, in a Pathé newsreel in 1945 or 1939. The refugees, the air raid warnings, the deliberate bombing of cities beyond the tanks crossing the border, but the deliberate targeting of civilians and other phenomena as well, war crimes. We had a report out today about just the prevalence of filtration camps, as they've been called, an anodyne, sterile word for concentration camps, taking people, putting them behind bars purely for their ethnicity as tools of war. The particular innovation, if you want to call it that, of this war is singling out children to be taken away from their parents in these camps. All these things that as a student of history, I imagined had been relegated to the past. These were stories from the mid-20th century, not from the year 2022 and 2023 of the 21st century, and yet here they are, a country taking or attempting to take another country by force and committing gross war crimes in the prosecution of that war. Forces believe that we believed we had beaten were back again. And a world that we thought, a relatively peaceful period of time that we'd been living in since 1989, 1991, was over. I often think that as a people, as a country, we're still congratulating ourselves in the movies for winning the war in 1945, duly so, understandably so. There's a movie like that out every few months, it seems. But right now, it's happening before our eyes today, a challenge to us and our children and our generation. It certainly hasn't been relegated to the past. I call it the New World Disorder. I'm not the first one to do it, but the conclusion is really the shadow war that you and I have written out a lot about, a below the threshold conflict between the US, Russia, and China became hot in Ukraine. And of course, there's concern that it may become hot in Taiwan as well, a different kind of Cold War. I bring up these pictures here because I talked a lot about the skepticism, and this has been a consistent theme. It struck me as I've tried to connect the dots of these seemingly isolated events around the world, from, well, balloons over Lake Huron or South Carolina to cyber attacks, to an invasion of Ukraine, to a possible march towards war in Taiwan, that these are part of, well, really a new Cold War with not one but two adversaries. There's been a lot of evidence of that growing conflict for years, really decades, that we've largely ignored, that people have had to almost be dragged kicking and screaming to acknowledge in these relationships, particularly between the US and China and the US and Russia. And an illustration of that was, as I was discussing just a couple minutes ago, the disbelief that Russia was really going to invade Ukraine. And that was even as we had satellite photos of this, of Russia just outside of the Ukrainian border with their attack helicopters amassed, the field hospitals, a key sign that they were getting ready for combat, the military trucks, the tents, aircraft as well here, that the US intelligence community, to convince the world that this was real, was declassifying a whole host of stuff that typically they wouldn't. And I know there are folks with intel backgrounds in this world, but boy, it was a great time to be a journalist, to get so much classified information out there to help tell the story of this. And yet, even with those revelations and sharing with the public, and by the way, not just photos, if you'll remember, intercepted communications between commanders and their superiors, telling them, get them ready, affix the bayonets, we're going in. Even with all that, there was still that disbelief that Russia would take this step. And you'll remember, even in this country, up into the final days, there was still this impression that, well, Putin's too smart to do this. The master strategist would never risk his economy, would never risk these kinds of losses. Of course he was, and we've been watching Ukraine pay for that in nearly 12 months since then. I mentioned those pictures because that was one case where the evidence before us was ignored right up to the moment of the invasion. But the fact is, we've had warnings about Russia's greater aggression, certainly in Ukraine and elsewhere, for some time. This is a photo I took in eastern Ukraine in 2014, around the time that the Little Green Men came into Crimea in a bloodless but still invasion of Ukrainian territory. This was in the Donbass, where Russia, during elections, was going to polling centers and just burning them, burning the buildings, burning the ballots, because they didn't want to acknowledge that people there wanted to be Ukrainian, not Russian. That was 8 years before the invasion. It was obvious what Russia wanted with the East, but we kind of imagined that they would never shoot a bullet to get that. Of course, they were shooting bullets. This is a picture taken in the Maidan, again in 2014, following what started as peaceful protests there against the Russian-backed President Yanukovych, but turned bloody when you had snipers seated on the roofs shooting at peaceful protesters, and many of them, it's believed, at least Ukrainian intelligence services have said, were Russian snipers. At the time, that seemed like a heavy death toll because you had more than 100 folks who died in the Maidan protests, Ukrainians. Of course, now when we think of the many tens of thousands, it seems like a drop in the bucket. But again, it was a warning we had far before Russian tanks crossed that border into Ukraine to begin this latest war. The truth is really, 2014 was not the warning, the first sign of what Russia was willing to do to exert its power abroad. You probably remember Alexander Litvinenko. So this is carrying us back to 2006. He was a Russian dissident living in London at the time, given asylum there, had the poor fortune of having written a book that accused Vladimir Putin of staging the apartment bombings in Moscow in 1999 as justification to expand the war in Chechnya. Putin sent 2 gentleman with polonium-210 on an Aeroflot flight from Moscow to London. They went and they injected the polonium-210 into his tea in the cafe at the Millennium Hotel in London, which I always remind people was about 50 yards from the US Embassy. They knew what the stuff was because they could trace it back to a particular reactor in a Russian nuclear plant based on the way nuclear physicists do this kind of thing, but also because they could then trace that radioactive material to the seat on the plane that they flew over, to the hotel room on Shaftesbury Avenue where they were staying, to the Emirates football stadium because they'd gone to a football match, the two assassins, while they were there, right up until they killed Litvinenko. To this day, British officials would talk about how this attack on Litvinenko was the first radiological terror attack on UK soil because the stuff is so radioactive that it wasn't just him who was poisoned, contaminated by it. His wife was, his son was, and then folks who came into contact with his wife and his son, and then folks who came into contact with folks who came into contact with his wife and son. There were primary, secondary, tertiary contaminations numbering in the many hundreds. Perhaps a sign of how far Russia and Putin were willing to go to extend its power. I have a picture of my wedding there, Sinclair, because I was covering that story in London in 2006 and went to those places to cover the story, to the Millennium Hotel, to the Itsu sushi restaurant where the assassins had met Litvinenko, and someone at my company, I was working for ABC at the time, said, you know what, you've been to a lot of places with radioactive material, you should probably get yourself tested. And I asked the British government, I said, is this really necessary? They said, like, absolutely, we've been testing all of our people. So a couple weeks before my wedding, in October 2006, I got a long and very laborious radiation test, which involved giving a lot of gallons and gallons of samples so they could run the numbers and thankfully run some ions through it, I suppose. I was not contaminated, but I did have to get tested. So the wedding went ahead, and a few years later, we have Sinclair and a few other boys, thankfully, perfectly healthy. Before I get there, which you might recognize as the South China Sea, because there is another front in this war, it's important to note that what we see as Russia and China's attempts to disrupt the world order, from their perspective, of course, it is not a negative. They don't see this as orderly at all. They see our rules-based international order as fundamentally in our favor. So that from their perspective, it's not a lamentable collapse of a peaceful system. It's a necessary and rightful overturning of a system that's built for U.S. national security interests and trade interests and political interests and not for their own. It's similar to the way, while we celebrate the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia, and Putin says this all the time, view it as the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And by the way, I'm sure the China scholars in the room know that senior Chinese officials study the collapse of the Soviet Union with the intent of preventing anything similar from happening to the CCP and China to this day. From their perspective, this is not a bad thing to overturn or to attempt to overturn that international order. Now, just to bring up the shadow war again and kind of where I'm going with this, the theory of the shadow war, and we're, I think, simpatico on a lot of these trends, is that even prior to it becoming hot in Europe, that Russia and China were already waging a war against the US and its allies, but a shadow war just below the surface of kinetic contact. So cyber attacks to look at vulnerabilities in our infrastructure, weaponization of space, putting kamikaze satellites up there that could take out US satellites, even kidnapper satellites. China has the ability to pluck them out of orbit if need be. Cyber attacks to steal state secrets, political interference like Russia's interference in the 2016 US presidential election, a whole host of new fronts, as it were, just below the threshold of real kinetic conflict. And it seemed that both China and Russia, though they're different countries, histories, continents, languages, you name it, had struck on quite a similar formula with similar fronts in space, in cyberspace, in terms of political interference and stealing of secrets. They call them by different names, but both of them are very public with these strategies. China calls it winning without fighting. Russia, I mean, we called it the Gerasimov Doctrine, but Gerasimov, who's now running things in eastern Ukraine, wrote about it very publicly in 2013, saying that this is a multi-front, constant war between Russia and the West, and this is the new way of fighting. The trouble is today that many of those trend lines that were designed, it seemed, and had successfully avoided a shooting war are heading in more aggressive directions. Case in point, of course, Russia invaded a country, big land war in Europe. That's not a shadow war, that's a bloody war, that's a hot war. China threatening to do the same to Taiwan. More aggressive cyber attacks we're seeing, and now I think we can say that there's another front to this that there hadn't been that much attention on, and that is near space. So you've already weaponized outer space, and as we see these balloons floating across North America and elsewhere, it's clear that NORAD and others did not quite grasp that China was exploring another potential soft point in terms of both gathering intelligence but also probing for weaknesses in the defense of the mainland and perhaps Taiwan. So we talked about the missed signs with Russia. Excuse me to have my wedding picture up there for so long, but heck, you know, it's a nice memory. In 2015, I got the chance to fly on a U.S. Surveillance jet over the South China Sea, a P-8 Poseidon. It was the first time they'd allowed a journalist up there, and the reason they were is they wanted to show the world, we know what China is up to in the South China Sea. They're turning little bunches of rocks that barely peaked above the waves at low tide into unsinkable aircraft carriers, creating thousands and thousands of acres of land and then militarizing them. Xi told Obama, I will not militarize, but they militarized, and there are missiles, and there are ships based there, and there are hardened hangars. This particular one, called Mischief Reef, my favorite name for a reef anywhere in the world, and I think perfectly named. If I was writing a Tom Clancy novel, I would probably call it Mischief Reef. That one is now, very well fortified these years later. I got to fly the P-8 Poseidon. They let me take the yoke for a little bit, which was very fun. It's a heck of a lot easier to keep it on steady flight once it's already up in the air. So I know, we got an Air Force guy over here. He's like, you didn't fly it through weather. That's true. But I did keep the little X in the circle, so no one suffered. What does the world look like in this space where you have a two-front superpower standoff, if not yet quite conflict? Berlin Wall is back up. Iron Curtain back down. And frankly, on a longer frontier than it was in the last Cold War, in Europe, because now you have extended NATO right up to the Arctic Circle, with the admission of Finland coming, it seems, but also up into the Arctic, where everybody is looking to exploit that area. That's another place I had the chance to spend some time on U.S. submarines up there during exercises. So you have a longer frontier becoming more militarized with every passing day, arguably worse. A bigger Berlin Wall, a higher one, a longer Iron Curtain. Plus, what makes this new standoff, as compared to the last Cold War, more dangerous is it has more fronts. In space, weaponization of space, highly capable attacks happening every day in cyberspace. No treaties for cyberspace. No treaties for outer space to govern how you weaponize, what constitutes an attack, how you respond to attack. There is no red phone for these things. And sadly, when you look at existing treaties on nuclear weapons, many of those have already gone away, like the INF, or are being repeatedly violated, like START, even as they try to negotiate a new one. And then you have new weapons in a whole category when you think of artificial intelligence. So arguably the New World Disorder more dangerous than the past Cold War. And that's the front, the V, because you got one frontier here and another one there. And when you think on each side, you got NATO here to the left, and on the right, you have existing mutual defense treaties, U.S. with South Korea, U.S. with Japan, and new ones, new cooperation agreements that are happening all the time, that I think I try to remind my viewers, but I don't think these things cross people's radar screens. The Reciprocal Access Agreement, that's between the UK and Japan. basing between those two countries. Not something you would have thought about just a few years ago. The Global Combat Air Program, that's the UK, Japan, and Italy working on common technology for warplanes. And of course, you have the expansion of the AUKUS Treaty now, with Australia basically signing on board to the US and the West, having for many years tried to make that relationship with China work. It didn't work. China weaponized trade, and Australia said, we're on board now. We want nuclear subs. So you have mutual defense treaties on both sides, which is an alarming way to divide the world. Of course, the trouble is, it doesn't just stop on the planet, because with the weaponization of space and near space, you have a whole bunch of other points. I love showing this picture because I think folks in general don't know how many living satellites are floating up there right now, with China, Russia, and the US very much in the lead. But that's just low Earth orbit. You get out to middle Earth orbit and geospatial, and it's the theoretical flies around the porch light. It's busy out there, and those are all potential fronts. I would say that I was talking about the kidnapper satellite. Hollywood is always a step ahead of the game. If you remember the movie Moonraker, some bad guy was stealing satellites out of orbit. China has the ability today to take satellites out of orbit with these satellites that they claim are maintenance satellites, but in reality, at least have that capability. Whether they use it is another question, but it's up there, and they've shown an ability to do that at all three orbital levels. Hollywood's always ahead of the game. Tarasov, I mentioned because not only did he come up with this kind of general strategy, but of course he's back very much at the forefront in what we're seeing in eastern Ukraine. The final thing I want to get to, because I'm conscious of time and I want to give a chance for hard questions from you and my daughter. Submarines. I mentioned that I went up to the Arctic. This is in 2018 for the ICEX exercises. They've been going on for a number of years, but the attention that the Navy is placing on them is certainly greater because Russian activity has become hotter up there, and crucially, Russian subs have become harder to track. And that's one reason we're practicing. And by the way, the Brits, who had been a part of those exercises in the past and took a little bit of a break, they're back into it. Folks know this is an issue, and they're trying. So Russia has two new classes of subs. They got the Bore class. This is the Boomer. This is the one designed to send hundreds and hundreds of warheads down on its targets. And then it's got the attack subs, Yasin class. I don't know if you heard about this, but in 2018, one of these evaded U.S. submarines tracking it in the North Atlantic for about 4 weeks. And that happened just a few weeks after I was up in the Arctic on a U.S. sub up there. And I kept asking guys, I was like, can you still track Russian subs all the time? And they said, it's getting harder, but we still can. This happened a few weeks later, and it caused a lot of alarm, understandably, in the Navy to not be able to track them like they used to. One area of potential cooperation that the U.S. is watching closely, and a guy named Andrew Erickson, I wonder if you guys have come into contact with in the past, has written a lot about this, is that with China and Russia, well, they're certainly selling each other a lot of oil. If Russia asks for more help, it's reasonable to conclude that China might ask for submarine help from Russia, because Chinese submarines are relatively loud, Russian submarines more advanced, and that may be the quid pro quo. And there's real concern at the strategic level in the U.S. that cooperation happens, and that upsets a whole host of defense strategies against China, particularly in the Pacific. So that a sub like that, maybe not all the goods, but some of the goods going from Russia to China to now, again, expand that two-front war into a whole nother realm. U.S. and Russia already competitive under the waves, but with China making advances there, that causes a lot of concern. I'll bring this up too, because what was the whole process? The whole theory of this was quiet submarine that could evade the U.S. and that the U.S. is concerned as a first strike weapon. Hollywood's always ahead of the game. I don't mean to be all negative, because one thing I found in my writing going back to the Shadow War, And the confidence that I have in people like you, in the military, in the State Department, and around the world, is that folks are thinking about this. And they've been thinking about this for some time and making changes to respond to these threats. The U.S. is investing a lot of money into their submarine technology, both in terms of keeping them quiet and being able to sense subs like the Russians. They are certainly strengthening alliances. We're seeing that in the NATO alliance's response to Ukraine to a degree that there was a lot of skepticism prior to the war. In fact, the assumptions were, the Europeans aren't going to come on board. At least the Germans are not going to come on board. The Italians are going to stand in the way. But one thing you've seen with a few exceptions is the consistency and the unity of those alliances. So you do have a lot of smart people looking for ways to respond to these new threats. But from my point of view, it's a clear and present danger, and one, as a reporter, as I've been covering Russia and China for so many years, see reminders of every day, whether it's in Ukraine, cyberspace, deployments to space, or things like we've seen in the last couple of weeks, big balloons and small ones floating over the U.S. This is the new world we live in. And I'm glad to have folks like you thinking about this so we can find ways not just to defend the U.S. and its allies, but to prevent that shadow war from becoming more of a hot war. So thanks very much for bearing with me, and I look forward to your questions.